Thank you, everyone. Thanks to all of you for being here. And I always like to say, this is first of all, this is my 32nd presentation in the last 5 days in 4 countries. So we saved the very best till last. I'm very excited about this, and I love what's happening here. But you'll also have to excuse me if I mumble now and then or fall off the stage or whatever. Mostly, I want to start off by saying how humbled I am that I get to speak in my native language. You know, this is something that we Americans, who are really, in this regard, very ignorant people. Very few of us truly can speak in more than one language. I know a little bit of 2 others, and one of them is not Polish. So I really, really appreciate your tolerance and your ability to converse with me in my language. Secondly, it's also really fun for me to be here, particularly because 2 sets of my great-grandparents come from this wonderful country, so it's particularly meaningful for me to be here. I have been involved with this whole paradigm, is really the way I think of it, of solutions journalism for 5.5 years now. First of all, let me ask, would you please raise your hand if you're a journalist, so I know who's in the audience. And then are there other people who are involved with sort of social change organizations? Okay, good. So this whole paradigm really is about the notion of journalism as a tool for social change. It stems, I think it's rooted in a fundamental debate and an argument that we have within the profession that I've had, frankly, with people with whom I've worked or who have worked for me over 30 years. I was an investigative journalist for most of my career. I was an investigative reporter, investigative editor, and ultimately the editor-in-chief of a newspaper called the Seattle Times, which is the largest newspaper in the northwest quadrant of the United States. Very big, very well-respected regional newspaper that does national level work. And over the years, I worked with many journalists whose approach to journalism was, our job is to report the news. Our job is to report what happened. And I always wanted to scratch my head and say, then why didn't you go to secretarial school and get a stenographer diploma? If all you want to do is talk about what happened. In journalism, that's not journalism. Journalism starts with what happened and talks about why did it happen, who made it happen, who got in the way of it happening, what's going to happen next, what might affect what will happen next. And so it's always been, the best journalism has always been about far more than what's going to happen. But now I think, for a variety of reasons, we're entering an era where even the traditional aggressive and investigative reporting isn't enough, and that's what we're going to talk about. The title of this, actually, and I don't know why the second line disappeared, except maybe my editor took it out, but it is called Turning the Watchdog into a Guide Dog. And the notion here, as you'll see, is beyond just pointing out problems and getting in much more into empowering the public about potential responses to problems. So as I say, most of my career I worked for a newspaper. I'm now the dean of what's called the Klein College of Media and Communication at Temple University in Philadelphia. So the way I got into this, actually, and I didn't really understand it until a couple of years later, is I actually was targeted. The people who came up with this idea of solutions journalism, a guy named David Boardman and a woman named Tina Rosenberg, they were having limited success in having the idea get any acceptance and traction in the United States. It was seen initially as happy news, good news, fluff, light news, soft news. And they had the notion that, boy, if we could get a newspaper, a news organization, and a journalist who has a reputation for investigative news, for hard-hitting, aggressive investigative news, to buy into this, that would really give us what we in the United States call street cred, credibility on the street, credibility among reporters. So I was their choice. David flew out to Seattle and educated me on this and got me to buy in. So when I'm talking to journalists in the States about this, I try to establish, okay, you know, I'm not a soft journalist. I'm not somebody who's just about good news or you know, a social worker. I'm a journalist. These are just some of the stories. I'll go really quickly through them, but some of the stories that I was directly involved in as a journalist, as a way to express to you where I come from as a journalist and why this represents for me what might seem to be a sort of rational leap, but it actually, a radical leap, but it's actually a very rational leap. I worked on a story in which we exposed a United States senator who had been in President Carter's cabinet, very highly respected, highly placed federal official, as a sex predator who was drugging and raping women.
Can you please take care that you feel
enough? Yes. The Boeing company was headquartered in our city of Seattle. We investigated a period when airplanes were literally falling out of the sky over a several-month period. There were 5 mysterious 737 crashes. Boeing blamed every one of these on pilot error or pilot intention. In 2 cases, they said it was intentional suicide by airplane by the pilots. Our reporters investigated this and discovered there was a major design flaw in the tail rudder section of the airplane, the cross at the back of the plane, in which metal shards were getting into the hydraulic fluid, jamming the ability to control the plane, and it was going into a tailspin. We uncovered, as you probably know, Native Americans, our indigenous people whom we used to call Indians. These people are among the very poorest Americans. They live on reservations that were created in the 19th century. They live in the most abysmal, many of them live in the most abysmal third world level conditions. Some live in cardboard boxes, tents, horrendous little lean-to huts. The federal government, of course, wanted to address this, put hundreds of millions of dollars into a program to build housing for these people. Gave it over to the tribes. The tribes have some degree of governmental sovereignty. And what the Seattle Times discovered was that in most of these cases, the money was being used by the tribal chiefs to build themselves mansions, like the one you see here. So very little of the money was actually going to the poor people. The tribal officials were using it for themselves. We discovered in Seattle, school bus drivers for the public schools are hired without any screening, or they were at the time. Anybody could apply to be a school bus driver, drive the little kids around to and from school. We discovered that 1 out of every 9 of those people had a serious criminal record. And would you want to put your little 5-year-old on a bus with some guy who had a sexual assault record or armed robbery or reckless driving? Of course not. This was quite a shocking discovery. We found that heavy industry, including the nuclear industry, was able to dispose of its toxic waste, including radioactive waste, without any processing at all by calling it fertilizer. And they were selling it to farmers who were putting it on their fields. It was killing the crops. It was making people and animals sick. And we discovered a system where coaches of middle school and high school girls were sexually abusing these girls, getting dismissed once this was discovered, but then turning up in the next school district with the same job because the districts didn't want bad publicity. They weren't telling anybody. We found 159 of these cases. So, this last one, so in almost every one of those cases there were bad guys involved. In this particular case, there was no bad guy involved. This was a case where the state of Washington had what on paper was a very good program to provide prescription drugs to people who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford them, but they had to buy the drugs that were on a list. There were only certain drugs on the list. And for people who were in severe pain, they had to use these drugs that we now have come to know as opioids. This was 7 years ago. What the state hadn't realized, and we discovered only by cross-tabulating the users of this program with death records, was that over a 5-year period, more than 2,000 people died of overdoses to these drugs. There wasn't a bad guy, but there was a system that required somebody, a journalist, to go in and uncover what the situation was. So all of these fit into what UNESCO offers as the classic definition of investigative reporting. Exposing to the public matters that are concealed either deliberately or by someone in a position of power or accidentally behind a mass of facts and circumstances that obscure understanding. I'm going to skip through these. I want to leave plenty of time to talk. So the theory of change, come back. The theory of change of investigative reporting is this. Often people in power are hiding bad deeds. Other problems, like the one I just talked about with drugs, sometimes they're institutional, incremental, insidious. Journalists just have to shine the light in those dark corners, point out the problem, and then the public will be inspired to rise up, demand change from their public officials, and everything will be great. That's the theory of change. Let me ask the journalist in the room, does that happen every time you do a story that points out a problem? Of course not. Sometimes it does. You know, sometimes, just like Joseph Pulitzer says in this quote, sometimes when we get those things out in the open, public opinion will sweep them away. But more often than not, what happens is nothing. You know, it's excuse, it's nothing can be done about that, or that's a problem everywhere, or you just don't understand, it's really complicated, or it would take much too much money, we'd have to raise taxes, we can't possibly fix that. So the result of all of this problem exposing, and all of this finger pointing, and all of this blame over many years has been to contribute, certainly not the sole factor in this, there are many factors, but certainly has been to contribute to this dramatic drop in trust that we see in media. Just a sense that all we do is bring problems to the world. In the States, you know, it's gone from 55% 20 years ago to 32% now. I know there are similar figures all over the world, and certainly in this country. We have found in academic studies, sociological studies, psychological studies, a sense of helplessness among many consumers of news. Just a sense that, you know, there's nothing we can do about this. I'm just going to go binge on Netflix and not pay any attention to the news. Sociologists now are identifying this condition called news fatigue, where people really are just feeling overwhelmed by all of this. The Associated Press did a poll in which they found that this news fatigue leads to a learned helplessness response, just the sense that, you know, nothing can be done about it, I just want to tune out. But the third bullet point on this screen is where we start the discussion of where can we go next. When people think something can be done, even just something modest, all of the evidence shows us that readers, listeners, viewers are far more receptive, far more attentive to the information. I'm going to skip these. These are just the graphs about the state of the business, which we all know is very rough. You know, I'm not one of those Americans who loves to brag about how wonderful our country is compared to anywhere else, because we all have our issues. But the one thing that I'm particularly proud of as an American is we were the first country that actually called out this profession in its founding documents, that actually established the freedom of the press in statutory form. that didn't happen automatically. In fact, there was quite a debate among our founding fathers, and they all were fathers, unfortunately, about whether freedom of the press should be established in our First Amendment. They all agreed on freedom of speech. There wasn't too much argument about freedom of religion. Lots of debate about freedom of the press. Thomas Jefferson, who was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, he was at this time the ambassador, U.S. ambassador to France. And he was consulted by the representative from his state of Virginia. How should I vote on this? Do you want freedom of the press in there, or should it not be? And he knew that Jefferson hated journalists. He'd had a lot of bad experiences with them. He just really didn't like journalists. And this is what he said: "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate for a moment to prefer the latter." So he was our third president. Here's our 45th, and here's what he has to say about the press. "The fake news media, the failing New York Times, NBC News, ABC, CBS, CNN, is not my enemy, it's the enemy of the American people." And he has said this in so many forms in the year plus that he's been in office. These, of course, are words very reminiscent of Joseph Stalin, the enemy of the people. They're also, as I'm reminded this week as I travel around Eastern and Central Europe, these words are they really echo the messages coming from the leaders of Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Austria, and at least party leaders here. And you could take that name off and put somebody else's name there from your country, and it wouldn't sound very different, would it? And I think that the really essential point for us at this point in time, and I think we really are at a crucial point in history, in terms of particularly the relationship of media and the people, is to understand these guys didn't create the distrust in media. In my country, a lot of journalists like to say, you know, this lack of trust in the media is the fault of Donald Trump blaming us for everything and calling us out like this. And what I've come to believe is that no, Donald Trump and all the rest of these characters, these populist leaders, they are still politicians who have picked up on this decline in trust that's been developing for a couple of decades and exploited it for their own use. Absolutely, they've made it worse, but they didn't create it. So, it's a pretty challenging situation right now, and I think it's really important that we as journalists take some ownership for it. Enter solutions journalism. I think this is an absolutely timely and powerful tool to address these questions of trust, this sense of news fatigue, of helplessness, and in fact even to address some of the financial challenges that we're facing as a profession and an industry. The BBC did a survey recently in which they asked their viewers and readers under the age of 35 if you could have one thing additional to what we're giving you now, if you could have more of something, what would it be? It wasn't entertainment news, it wasn't more football news, it was news that showed potential solutions to problems. Some sense, news and information that gave them some sense of hope and purchase about the future. 64% of the people under 35 asked for that. As I said, there's a lot of emerging evidence, both in academic research and anecdotally, that readers, viewers, listeners are more receptive and attentive to this information. New York Times did a study of its most emailed stories, and it found that positive content is far more viral than negative content. Now, I want to insert here, solutions journalism does not equal just positive news. And in fact, I'm sure some of you have been exposed to this notion of constructive journalism that's coming out of Denmark primarily. There's a lot of overlap between what we define as solutions journalism and what they define as constructive. But a really key difference in this is that they believe that, okay, we need to balance negative news with positive news. We don't look at it that way at all. We look at, again, solutions journalism is simply an evolution of investigative journalism. It's the next iteration. It's the complete story. It's giving our readers the complete story, the whole story. It's not we're trying to give them positive news. But it is interesting to see that news that readers perceive as positive or hopeful is far more viral. If you were to look at on an often better in the positive deviance and dim. Skip that one. Where do we find the ideas for these things? There are many places. Certainly, it's interesting, since I came into the academy, I've come to realize all the amazing work that's done by scholars that only gets read by other scholars. There's if you have an area of expertise, it's absolutely worth getting to know people in scholarly research, because a lot of their research focuses on what's working. Big data, as we talked about, social media. We'd like to joke that on Facebook, everybody's life is perfect. All we ever share is all the great things that happen to us. Well, same thing happens with institutions that have social media presence. And there's a lot to be seen there in terms of what's working. Government officials, we as journalists like to joke, and many of us actually believe that these guys are all crooks and they're all just trying to line their pockets, whatever. The truth is that's not the case. There are many public servants who truly are public servants, and to just ask them, hey, do you know of anybody who's doing a better job of handling this problem? Can sometimes lead to some really great story ideas. And then, of course, NGOs working in the field have many stories of success. As I said, this idea was a total mystery in the States 5 years ago. It's now in the lexicon, at least. It's in the conversation in many American newsrooms. I know you can't read this type, but these are just examples of major solutions journalism work that's been done around the country by very big institutions like NPR and much smaller ones. The website for this entire concept and this organization is called solutionsjournalism.org, and you'll find many tools there, but among my favorite is something called the Solutions Story Tracker. And this is a curated library of solutions-oriented journalism from all over the world. When I took a picture of this page, which was a couple of weeks ago, it was 2,986 stories from 130 countries. I noticed today those numbers are a lot bigger. As we've met with some news groups the past couple of days, we've told people, like, give us a topic. And in fact, let me see if I can do this over here, because it is kind of illustrative.
Okay, now you're going off the script.
I'm going off the script. Solutionsjournalism.org.
David, he will have it covered.
Oh yeah, don't put pressure on.
All right, well, I'll just describe it. You can plug in any term. So last night we were at Talk FM, and they suggested air pollution, which is a big issue in this country, obviously. We popped up. Oh, okay. Story tracker, right there. Yeah, get that. And now plug in air pollution. And it pops up. Do we have an internet problem in this room?
No, just a problem.
Okay, right there, air pollution. And normally,
Yeah.
pop right up. 75 results. And these are stories of really interesting, creative, and in many cases successful approaches to air pollution. The first one, Italy's pollution-eating cement. How Brazil's Valley of Death drastically cut pollution. Air pollution, new attempts to tackle Cairo's black cloud. You know, these are ideas. This is information that can really inform readers. It's an amazing tool for journalists, and at the very least, a great place to start in your reporting. And you know, there's a whole range of stories in there, as I said, about more than 3,000 stories now. Let's go back. Thank you. I'll talk briefly about just a few case studies in this so you can see a little bit more about how it works. These two newspapers are of far, far different size from two cities that are from very, very different size. Chicago, you know, because I think it's the highest population of Poles outside of Poland. It's our third largest city. Chicago Tribune is the big newspaper there. Fayetteville, North Carolina is a much, much smaller city. And this is its newspaper, the Fayetteville Observer. These two cities are very, very different, but they had one thing in common. They both were among the nation's highest rates of murder a couple of years ago. And Chicago remains at that level. They had just soaring murder rates, and they both had spiked. And both newspapers, of course, were troubled and wondering, well, what can we do about this? How can we inform our readers in a way that might make this better? They took two very different approaches. Chicago took what I would think of as a much more traditional approach. They took the shock treatment. Many of the murders in Chicago took place on the south side of Chicago, which is almost exclusively African American, and many of their readers lived on the north side, mostly white. They thought, let's just take people down there and show them how horrendous this is. So they inundated their readers in the newspaper and online with images of violence and grief. Just one after another after another. What came of that approach? Nothing. And in fact, I would certainly surmise that a lot of their readers simply just tuned out and turned away. Fayetteville, on the other hand, took a very different approach. They took a solutions approach. Their approach was, and even though they had many fewer resources, let's spend the next year looking at creative approaches to crime. Let's look at what other communities have done. So one of the things they did is they went to Atlanta, Georgia, a few hours away, and they discovered that a program in Atlanta in which the authorities came to learn that the simple act of cleaning up a neighborhood, picking up the garbage, fixing the broken windows, taking care of abandoned buildings, painting over graffiti, the simple act of improving the physical spaces in a neighborhood had a dramatic impact on violent crime. Just sent it down dramatically. So the people in Fayetteville tried that. And what happened? Made a difference. Their crime rate declined dramatically. Minneapolis, Minnesota. It's a city in the middle of the country, large, pretty upper class city, overwhelmingly white. It was settled primarily by Scandinavians in the 19th century. But it has a multi-generational Somali community. So this is an issue that will resonate for lots of European cities. The problem was that this Somali community, over the last 25 years of its existence, was becoming increasingly, well, had always been, in fact, very isolated from the rest of the community. These people were mysterious, they were Muslims, they were, for the most part, the only Muslims in that metropolitan area. And what was happening with that isolation, as we've seen in communities all over the world, the young people, and particularly the males, were feeling ostracized, they were feeling alien and foreign, they became radicalized, and many of them were going off to fight for radical Muslim groups, particularly ISIS. Against that backdrop, and particularly with the growing anti-Muslim sentiment in the U.S., the community was getting even more isolated because now people were afraid of these people. The other people in Minneapolis were, oh, they are a threat to us. What's going on here? We shouldn't trust them. They're scary. They want to kill us. And so then the Somali community was feeling even more isolated and ostracized. So it was just this cycle of fear and hatred and suspicion. The newspaper had covered this. They covered it for years. They covered it very much as a sort of looking at part of their community as a foreign land. You know, not in the same way they would cover any other neighborhood, but very much from a distance. Very much us and them. They decided to change that. They took a solutions approach. First thing they did was they sent out teams of reporters, photographers, videographers to other places in the world that had experienced this problem in search of approaches that worked. They found in Aarhus, Denmark, a really effective creative program that was respecting the cultural heritage and integrity of the Somali community, but was finding ways to make them feel part of the larger community, and had really dramatically reduced the level of radicalization of the youth. They set up listening posts in Minneapolis, actual physical listening posts, where they posted questions on signs and had digital microphones where people in the Somali community would actually be able to respond to questions, and then they captured that audio. So it was different than holding a mic in somebody's face. Somebody could go up at their own convenience and in their own space and make a comment, answer a question. They translated the content in their newspaper and on their website into Somali to try to help the Somalis feel more a part of the community. They hired a young Somali journalist, and this was a particularly cool thing they did. Because the majority community hardly ever went into the neighborhood, they took people into the neighborhood using 360 VR technology. And let's see if it works. I'm not sure it's going to work with the problem of wireless, but let's try.
Capital of Somalia. It just has so much culture, so many stories. My name is Samaya Keenan, and this is my grandparents' store. I'm a business major, and I hopefully want to take over the family business. This shop right here, we pretty much have everything from dollar store to clothing, and now me bringing my bridal collection. It's a one-stop store for locals.
So you get the idea. I mean, they took people, they actually took us, the rest of us in. We could see, oh, that doesn't look dangerous. She doesn't sound dangerous, that doesn't look dangerous. I might even want to shop there. Here's a restaurant where I might want to eat. You know, just a very different perspective on the community. And then I think the most important thing they did was they changed the frame of their reporting. Just like we talked about with that Pennsylvania data. The way we usually do things is, you know, to look at the problem first. In this case, the editor said, you know, these people have been here for 25 years now. When did they get to be us? When did they get to be part of our community? We have to stop looking at this as us and them, or the threat that they pose. We really ought to be thinking of this as a problem of losing our children. We're losing our Minneapolis children who are going off to fight for ISIS. It's a different way of thinking about the story, and so their reporting was different. The results of this was, well, this is a good example of this too. Can we try this one? So this is, you know, again, a different perspective than you might normally see in terms of getting a perspective.
that happens in their school when people ask me, like, why do you wear the hijab? And they, like, say, are you bald?
Do you have cancer because you cover your hair? He said that in ISIS, they took on my scarf and they try to look like me, but they don't know how much it hurts.
Yeah, I felt sad.
And kind of mad. We're saying about the Middle East and all the Islamic countries, and they'll be saying that that's where ISIS live and that's where the Muslim terrorist people are, and they like say it out loud and like make me like uncomfortable about it.
Like a kid, I think he's in 4th grade or 5th grade, he said, why don't we have a white America? Or why do we have Muslims and why can't we have a Christian America? And then they said because people came here to be free, and it means a lot to them because they came here to practice their religion, and I think people should understand that other people want to be free.
It's pretty powerful, I think. And again, you know, a lot of traditional hardcore journalists would not look at that as journalism. To me, that's journalism. You know, we're giving people information. We had an interesting discussion last night at Talk FM where one of the more seasoned journalists said facetiously, but I think reflecting what a lot of his colleagues might say, so now do we have to have a blue-eyed, blonde-haired Nazi saying, you know, these people shouldn't be here? And traditional journalism, we do tend to do that. We create these false equivalencies. We take this, well, here's one perspective, we better put the other one in, you know, whether it has any real currency, legitimacy or not. And again, you might say, well, that's a political statement. I would say it's not a political statement, it's just information. It's information. People can act on it or not act on it as they will. I will tell you that the work that this newspaper did changed the dialogue in that community, changed the relationships. And you always have to be careful about cause and effect, so I'm not going to say that coverage was a direct cause of this, but the rate of radicalization of these young men dropped dramatically. Seattle Times, this is my former newspaper. As I mentioned, I was the editor-in-chief of this paper, and before I left to go into education, the last big project I did was a solutions project, started this project that we call Education Lab. The problem, Seattle is one of the richest cities in the world and one of the most economically and culturally impactful. Medium-sized city of about maybe 700,000 in the city, you know, maybe 1.5 million in the metropolitan area. Home of Microsoft, Amazon, Starbucks, Boeing, and just a company called Costco. I don't know if they have that here. I mean, just an amazingly influential city. The 2 richest men in the world live there, Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos, the head of Amazon. Despite all that wealth, despite all that technology, one of the worst public school systems in the United States of America. In fact, when we started this project, Washington State was 47th of the 50 states in money spent per pupil in the public schools. The result of that was really declining test scores, bad performance in the schools, people blaming the teachers in the teachers' union saying, no, we don't have enough resources, and a very politicized, polarized discussion where nothing was happening, it was just frozen. Meanwhile, test scores were just getting worse and worse. What we call the achievement gap between white students and minority students was getting wider, not better. Really was a hopeless situation. It was one of these, we're helpless, nothing can be done about it. But we decided that something could and should be done about it. So, first thing we did was we got some money. And I want to really emphasize this for the journalists in the room and those whose organizations are facing significant financial issues. And I guess I also want to emphasize it for anybody who works for an NGO or a funder. For the first time, we're seeing funders and NGOs and foundations and charities understand the power of journalism and understand that they can't affect significant change without addressing the communication factor. And there's money to be had out there. We got a significant grant from the Gates Foundation. We're a for-profit newspaper. We've never taken money from anybody other than advertisers. But we decided, we can take money for this coverage to improve our coverage. It's going to make our journalism better. As long as they understand, as long as the people giving us money understand that once they give us the money, that's the end of the conversation. They have no influence whatsoever over what we do and how we do it. And that every story we publish, every video we post, will say this coverage was financed in part by the Gates Foundation, but they had no influence over the content. And that's what we did. We created a team of reporters, an editor, and a job we'd never had before called a community engagement specialist. So we made the decision we were not only going to produce this content, we were going to make sure that it was talked about. We were going to make sure that it got out there into the community as part of the conversation. We were going to make sure that we would go back to our historical mission as the town square of the community. Just like in these other examples, we traveled the nation and the world to look for effective responses to some of the problems that we're facing in state education. And we produced, and they continue to produce 5 years later, really significant journalism. Here's an example on student discipline. In the United States, and I'm happy to know that this does not occur here, but in the United States, if you're a bad kid in school repeatedly, the typical discipline is you get kicked out of school. It might just be for a day, it might be for a week, or you might just be expelled long term. Most often it's what we call suspension. You're just suspended from school. In Washington, this was happening increasingly at the primary grades. 6, 7, 8-year-old kids were getting suspended. Our reporting revealed that when you do that, you're basically giving those kids a life sentence, because the statistics, if they're suspended early, they often don't even finish school, don't even finish high school. And so we framed some coverage around, well, what can be done about this? And as we went around the country and the world, we learned that intervention works better than punishment. We also discovered that race was a big factor in how students were disciplined. Black kids and white kids who did the exact same bad behavior, the black kids got suspended at a much higher rate. So the reporters produced a series of really meaningful stories about new approaches to this. The result was, in addition to the reporting, there was a lot of community engagement on it. Live chats, video hangouts, live events. These are some of the things that were done. And the result was real impact on public policy. School districts in Seattle stopped suspending children. They began with a 1-year moratorium, and that has continued now. And the state of Washington requires school districts now to form these community boards that deal with these issues of discipline and truancy in an entirely different way. In addition, the public policy, of course, as journalists, is what matters to us most, but these days the money does too. And this was phenomenal, what we discovered. These percentages compare the consumption of these solutions-oriented education stories to regular education stories. The page views for the solution stories were 102% higher. The time on the page for the solution-oriented stories was 80% higher. The social sharing of these stories in social media was 230% higher. And the return rate to the coverage was 64% higher. That's pretty powerful stuff. What is it? What are the implications of that for the future of journalism and for newspapers in particular? The historical business model for newspapers has been we sell the paper really cheap because we're trying to create a mass audience for advertisers. We say, okay, Mr. Advertiser, we're going to give you 1 million people reading this coverage or your ad, And of those million eyeballs, at least 10 of them are going to want to buy your car, so it'll pay for itself. We provided these aggregated audiences for advertisers. Now they don't need us anymore. They go right to the buyers, and the buyers go right to them. Advertising is not the future of news from a financial standpoint. What is the future of news from a financial standpoint is consumers actually paying for quality content, whether that's through digital subscriptions, memberships, crowdfunding. And the only way they're going to do that is when we see this sort of figure, when we see that they actually value the content. We surveyed the readers afterwards. You can see very positive response to that. And 87%, nearly 9 in 10 of the readers, recognized and appreciated this solutions approach. And then a surprise benefit of all this was something I never anticipated when we started, was that other companies, private companies like this one, Alaska Airlines, which is headquartered in Seattle, it's a major West Coast airline, they wanted to be associated with the coverage. They wanted to have their ads next to it on the website. They wanted to sponsor the live events and conversations that we did. They saw it as corporate social responsibility work. And they brought money. They brought money to the table. We're now working, there are 11 universities in the U.S. that are working on bringing this approach into the classroom. We met today with faculty of SWPS, journalism faculty, and they are very interested in bringing it to this country and teaching students these techniques. This is some of the work that our students have done. We teach it not as a methods class, but we teach it around a topic. So at Temple, drug and alcohol addiction is a really big issue, both in the city of Philadelphia and among college students. So we built the class around addiction. And our students produced a website that not only won a national award for student journalism, it actually beat professional journalists. The quality was so high. And then last year, I mean, this is, as you know, it's certainly going beyond the borders of the U.S. And The Guardian now has made this a major theme of their coverage. Frankly, I hate the title, The Upside, because that connotes positive, happy news. And again, that's not my vision of this, but the actual content, much of it is really, really good, and it does fit our definition of solutions journalism. So that's what it's about. It's my perspective on it. Let's talk about it.